I got all I want, and I got all I need, and I got everything. I got you and me. All I want, I got all I need.
So Becca recently sent me a little Facebook reel, and it is titled 85% of affairs start at work. And today I thought, why not talk a little bit about this idea of affairs at work and how so many of them, affairs happen at work, and why that's relevant, and maybe how we can kind of move through that knowledge or incorporate that knowledge into a sustainable system at home. Marriage is the best. I was listening to an interesting discussion that my wife sent me. Dr. John Deloney and one of the other, Ken Coleman, I was going to say one of the other Ramsey hosts, Dr. Deloney and Mr. Ken Coleman, were talking a little bit about how affairs start at work. And they were discussing like how that happens, and essentially telling this story of at home, you've got all of these expectations, this really intense amount of expectation, right? You're required to be, co-parent, co-housekeeper, co-emotional support, co-financial support, co-everything. And these are mostly his words, or kind of, this is his idea that he's giving. Because there's all these roles that we're playing, there's all these demands on each other at home. And then you go to work and the demands lift, right? Basically, the demand at work is to be competent and to do a good job. And if you're doing a good job and you're competent at work, then oftentimes you're getting more appreciation, you're getting more encouragement, you're getting more positive feedback at work than maybe you're getting at home. And then all of a sudden, right, like that just, it grows, especially if you're working in close proximity to that person. So I just thought that was an interesting tidbit on how affairs start. It makes a lot of sense. And I was thinking that, and because Becca brought that to my attention, I figured I would just talk a little bit about that reality, that 85% of affairs are currently starting at work due to the data that the couple of guys were discussing. How does that relate to your marriage? Well, first of all, I'm not saying that your husband or wife is, starting an affair at work. But if we're going to take the affairs at work idea and kind of broaden it out into what it means to have a sustainable system at home, it means that we need to acknowledge where some of the threats to marriage come from. So one threat of the marriage is an affair. That is one threat to the marriage, I should say. And if we're going to look at affair proofing your marriage, then you're going to want to acknowledge that there is power in relationships at the work front, because the data would say that there's a lot of power there. Becca and I created a very long-standing, very difficult and laborious tradition of talking about all the relationships that I have at work. We talk about counseling relationships, we talk about coworker relationships, we talk about managerial relationships, we talk about all the relationships. And so in order to create kind of an environment where she's free to ask me questions and engage me on the different relationships that I have, obviously within the context of HIPAA, not giving any information away, but we talk about the dynamics. We talk about ranges of things, right? So we won't be specific about. I won't be specific about sharing detailed information, but we do talk about what's going on at work. And I find that every time that I talk to my wife about the things going on at work, I am more confident in our marriage. I am more aware of how I am communicating or engaging with people at work. I'm more aware of my own thoughts and feelings as I move through my day. And it helps me to have a consistent check-in with my own mind of how I'm coming across, an accountability, if you will, to how I'm coming across and how I'm communicating. And I think that that's important for me because in my line of work, it is a deeply personal and interpersonal job, right? I'm very often talking to and discussing very deep emotional things with people. And Becca understands that. She gets that. And she also, as a woman, really knows what that does to her when I engage her on a deep emotional, relational level. And as her husband, that is absolutely, one of my many hats that I need to play, roles that I need to jump into to stay connected to my wife and to have a sustainable system in my marriage. And so we've created that safeguard, and it's less of a stringent, legalistic sort of requirement of disclosing different conversations or like policing or checking in on one another, and more of a, hey, part of our keeping our marriage healthy, part of keeping our marriage safe, part of keeping our marriage intentional and sustainable is the ability to enter into these hard conversations. They're kind of uncomfortable at times. They're kind of weird sometimes, right? Like, why do we have to talk about this? Or, it honestly, it takes a lot of energy to engage in conversations like that, because even if there is nothing to share, it's still a conversation that can very easily trigger a shame or inadequacy, an area of shame or inadequacy in me. Like, I'm not doing enough. I'm not being enough. And it also triggers that same kind of deep vulnerability in her of the fear and the loneliness, right? So the whole system triggers the vulnerabilities, the deep vulnerabilities that we both have. And that's nothing to scoff at. Like, there's a deep, resonating, impactful kind of ripple effect within those conversations because they're so vulnerable and sometimes difficult to enter into. And I think that's okay. I think that vulnerable conversations are difficult, and that the more that we do them, the more that we can practice becoming non-defensive during them, the better that we get at entering into them. And, Becca and I have similar conversations, or maybe not similar in topic, but similar in kind conversations where I'm asking her questions about, the her part, the part that she's bringing in, the part that she needs to be mindful of. And in doing that, we have had more difficult, stressful, and overwhelming conversations than I think most couples who have been married as long as we have. But I also believe that we have seen really incredible fruit from having a consistent, open conversation. Some of this actually kind of harkens back to our conversation last week about integrity and how, having those hard conversations and sharing difficult moments, sharing difficult things can be really important in the process, is really important in the process of marriage, and incredibly important if you want to sustain your marriage. If you want to make your marriage last, then having difficult and vulnerable conversations is basically a requirement. Because the hidden things in our lives and the difficult things that we're not talking about tend to have the power to do the most damage to our relationships. And so it's interesting to know that 85% of affairs start at work, and that when you feel that ease at your workplace and you just kind of settle into yourself and you act and engage competently and you act and engage with other people around you, It's important to know and be mindful of those relationships. And it may even be important to have conversations about how those relationships are feeling and how you're engaging with those at work. You know, if there is a connection that you're feeling to someone at your workplace, then I think it would be important for your spouse to know that. Because again, your goal is to sustain your marriage. Your goal is for it to last. And so in order for it to last, something as dangerous as another person outside of the relationship coming into the relationship, probably the most destructive thing that can happen in a marriage outside of abuse and neglect and things of that nature, we guard our marriages well by informing our partners how moving through work, how the connections at work, how the engagements at work are going. Now, I'm not saying, in having this conversation and in having worked through many conversations about work and relationships, some of them very, very short and just quick check-ins, some of them longer and more detailed and more engaging. We've done the work to open the lines of communication in this area. And so I'm going to assume now that you haven't had open lines of communication in this area and that you would be looking to start. That would be kind of my next question is like, okay, I can acknowledge what you're saying. That might be real, but what does that mean for me to actually go and do something about it? So I would say that if you are currently experiencing a connection with someone at work, then the first step that I would take would be to really begin to self-monitor and acknowledge where your heart's at and why your heart is there. So there's probably a good reason for the engagement. So I would kind of search that out and I'd figure out, where is that coming from? Do your own work on that first. Then I would, in the maybe context of counsel, talk to someone in your circle who, no, I don't like that either. Then I would prepare your spouse. Dang, man, this is hard. It's so much easier to say like what this is and why it's dangerous and just don't do it than how do I heal from something like this? How do I go about disclosing? Ultimately, I think that your partner deserves to know and understand the dynamics that you're experiencing at work day to day, and keeping that thing hidden from them is going to do much more damage in the long run, no matter how long you can keep it hidden, than if you were to be honest with yourself and with them. We're finding integrity again here. So I guess the second step would probably just be like acknowledging that at work there is a connection and acknowledging some of those feelings, as you did your work on being aware of those feelings and what they were and where they were coming from. Maybe you could start there and just kind of let them know that it be, just in an effort to be honest, I need to tell you that there's this connection that I've been feeling and I don't really want it to be there, which is, the vast majority of people who aren't wickedly bitter and like down that road really far really don't want to feel that way toward people that they're working with. That's a really big sweeping statement. I don't even know if I would believe that fully. But I would say that within the assumption that your partner has your best interest at heart and is well-meaning toward you, I would assume that the connection that they're feeling is not something that they're intentionally pursuing, and that the connection that they're feeling is something that they are willing to work on so as to guard and protect the marriage. And although it will be very painful to hear that these connections are happening, and they've been happening maybe for quite some time, it will definitely create maybe a grief, and it'll definitely create some hurt. The grief and the hurt that you create now is actually better than the loss of the relationship and the woundedness that would come into play later on down the road. One way that you could move through something like this would be to go and get some counsel from a third party to help you and kind of assist you in talking through what that conversation needs to look like. And so I would maybe encourage engaging in that kind of a conversation with a good trusted friend, a mentor of sorts, a pastor, if you have one of those, a parent, if you're close with them. Yeah, someone who's close to you and maybe understands you and may be able to help you. You know, the other thing that you could do is you could literally just write to us. Yeah, you could literally write to us, you know, the situation, what's going on, what you've identified. Do your own work before you do it. But like, tell us what's going on. And then Becca and I can kind of chew on it from different perspectives. Mine from a clinical male perspective and hers from a brilliant female perspective. And I would offer that. And I would say that we could together figure out a way to communicate this in such a way that is not so damaging to the relationship that you're going to, without the proper delivery, you're going to destroy something. But at the same time, I also believe that people have it within themselves to understand and know know themselves and know their spouse and know their situation and know how far this thing has gone, to go ahead and kind of address and talk through this. So I would say those three things. I would say do your own work first, become really aware of what's been going on. Secondly, I would say it's important to consider what you're going to tell your spouse. And thirdly, I would talk with a mentor or a close friend, someone who knows you well, someone who will be able to kind of hear and understand your side and also encourage you in your pursuit of your marriage and a sustainable system within that. Hopefully you've got somebody like that. And if you don't, feel free to write us. This is not something that you need to take care of today, because this is not something that happened today. If, you know, as you think through this isn't something that is a moment. It's not a moment in time that you chose this. There's a whole bunch of context that you were experiencing that kind of led to this, right? And so instead of, making a brash decision and going and disclosing and feeling really good about it and then moving on with your life and leaving them to pick up the pieces or them to like have to handle this all, I would be kind of slow and gentle and careful. I would obviously immediately stop any sort of behavior that would lend itself toward instability or unsustainability. And really put a check on the amount of time, especially if you have any alone time access, because being alone with someone that you find attractive or that you're working with in any, positive light, right? Receiving positive feedback from, can create, those deeper feelings and deeper connections that ultimately lead to destruction. It's interesting because affairs are a fantasy world that people enter into as they step away from the reality of their relationship, the reality of the hurt in their relationship, the reality of the distance in their relationship, the woundedness that they haven't been able to address, the sexual disconnection that they haven't been able to address. Affairs are a response. They're a deeper issue than anything that's going on in the moment. So these things don't happen over the course of a day. I mean, they can, and in some ways they do, but like the greater context for all of this really does make a big difference. And so that's where some counseling or some third-party help can help you to kind of work through what happened, how did it happen, what created this susceptibility to this, what were the decisions that created the moment, right? These things don't happen in a vacuum. There was lots of decisions that led up to this. Then there was this moment. And so now we're talking more about the actual affair moment. And then, so even if it's not a full-blown affair, even if it's just an emotional connection, even a small one, it might be helpful for your spouse to be aware of that. And it might be helpful for you to have your spouse be aware of that, because in being aware, both yourself and your spouse, you're going to move through those conversations and connections and that time that you're spending with that person in a different way. We should be able to update it through practice, through disclosure, through openness. And it very well may be that your disclosure actually sparks reconnection, because there's an intimate thing that's missing in your relationship that now can be mended. But if we leave it off the table, then we do not have the ability to mend that broken thing that is represented in this extramarital connection. And you know how I feel about extramarital connections. We talked about it a long time ago. If you want to go check that episode out, it's early, so it's probably pretty rough, but you could totally go check it out if you'd like. If you want to check out some of our sustainable systems episodes, those kind of are geared toward helping you to understand what does it mean to be sustainable in a marriage, because sustainability is difficult and it is intentional. So it is a difficult thing to achieve, and you need to be intentional about creating it. And so this is one of those things, having these nice, open, honest conversations that very well may create an increased sense of stability and sustainability in your marriage. If you want to hear more about affairs or other things like this, feel free to write to us. If you want to go on Spotify or Apple and put the 5-star thing on the deal with the measurement of the liking of the podcast, that would be helpful. It's grown actually since last time I looked, and that was kind of cool. I was pleasantly surprised. So remember to do that. If you want to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, we'll read it on the air, and we'll say whatever you need to say on the air. And there you go. You could get your story written right there. We are still working on interviews. We're still getting equipment, honestly, is one of the hookups for more interviews, because I currently can only interview one person at a time. And I've got some interviews lined up that require two. So we're going to keep working on it. We're going to keep trying our best to represent healthy, balanced marital conversations, and we hope that you enjoy it. So this is the end.
All I need, and I got everything. I got you and me. All I want, I got all I need.
This was not supposed to be like a full episode. I was going to do a section on marriage and culture, or like, here's a reel that Becca sent me, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, this interesting data point. And then I was talking about it, and then I was talking more about it, and then I kept talking about it. And 25 minutes later, I realized instead of jumping topics and engaging another topic, we're just going to go ahead with marriage and affairs. We'll talk a little bit about that. And I think that's what happened. And so that's what you're getting today. If you are interested in hearing other topics or other stories, or if you find things online, YouTube, Reels, whatever it might be, that you would like a perspective on, or if you have a feeling, like a certain reaction to a certain thing that you're reading or listening to or watching, that you're like, I wonder about that. Like, why is my reaction this or that way? I would send that to us, because it would be really interesting for us to hear and see and understand what you're seeing out there in the world of marital advice, so that we could kind of break down what does that look like, and we could talk through that on our end and then present to you a perspective on it. So if you're interested in that, feel free to send it our way, especially if it's like this visceral, deep response of like, oh, I reject this. We could kind of, we could curb some of the defensiveness that you're probably experiencing, because I know that I need to check in with that very often. And then Becca can kind of bring in her wisdom and femininity, and I'll bring in my thoughts and my masculinity, and we can balance each other out and try and figure out, like, what is this? Is it good? Is it bad? Does it relate to sustainability at all? And we can go from there. So feel free to send it to us. I think the email is in the bio, and if it's not, then it would be very difficult to find. But I think it's just marriageisthebest@yahoo.com. And if you're listening to Marriage is the Best, we are grateful for you. And it probably means that you're aimed at, improving your marriage and enjoying your marriage more, creating more sustainability in it. And that's pretty cool. And so good on you.